All right, we're back. And so now let's talk about some other ways of describing intelligence besides these composite abilities. Sorry. There we go. All right. So the first one I wanted to address is one that you might have actually encountered when you were in K through 12 education, when you were younger. A lot of educators really like Gardner's theory of intelligence. His basic premise is that we have multiple different kinds of intelligences and that they're all independent of each other. So let me show you a little diagram. This will help you to visualize, and I'll explain each of the different kinds of intelligences as we go. So what it means to say multiple and independent is that there are all these different kinds of intelligences, and each one is completely independent of the others. So you could be high in one of them and low in a bunch of the others, or middle level on some and higher on other, like any mixture. They are not connected to each other. They are not dependent on each other. So first one is verbal or linguistic intelligence. And this is kind of classic intelligence. This is part of most intelligence testing, where we look to see whether you are fluent in your language, can you read, understand what you read, all those kinds of just sort of normal, stereotypical assumptions about intelligence, right? Like the verbal skill would be part of it. And then the other one that is really stereotypical, most of us assume is part of intelligence, would be logical, mathematical ability. So the numerosity, like I mentioned before, being able to combine numbers, those kinds of things, that falls under the logical, mathematical, and then also logical stuff like being able to solve riddles and those kinds of thought puzzles, those kinds of things. That's all part of logical intelligence. Musical rhythmic. Now this is new. This is not part of any other composite interpretation of intelligence. Musical rhythmic is looked at as a separate kind of intelligence, and some people have great rhythm, other people don't have any rhythm, right? Some people have like perfect pitch and can recognize a note, and other people have no idea, right? Like Gardner argued that musical intelligence is separate from other kinds of intelligence, and that it is, in fact, a type of intelligence to be able to be rhythmic, appreciate music, produce music, those kinds of things. Bodily kinesthetic. This is knowing where your body is in space, having good control over your body. So dancing, athletic, behaviors, these kinds of things would all fall under bodily kinesthetic. And he thought that was a type of intelligence. Visuospatial. Now this is going to have an art component to it, so being able to produce art or being able to appreciate art, but it's also going to have sort of spatial knowledge incorporated in it. So knowing where north is without having to consult a compass, knowing your position in space. So am I tilted in this experimental chair where I'm so strapped in that I don't feel like I shifted, but I can tell relative to the floor that I must be tilted. I was just watching this Strange Evidence or some kind of show like that where they try to look to see whether, sort of non-scientific things can really happen. And they were at a hill in England, and we actually have a hill like this in Washington, where people insist that they put their car in neutral and it rolls uphill. Like people are convinced that they're rolling uphill and defying gravity. And people generate all these crazy explanations like, well, maybe it's magnetic, but balls roll uphill too and they aren't made out of metal, right? So it's like, it's probably not magnetic. It turns out that it's a visual illusion where they perceive that the road is going up, but it's actually going down, and they are perceiving it incorrectly relative to the hills around it and stuff like that. Visuospatial intelligence would tap into that ability to recognize that these visual cues are giving me incorrect information and that really it's actually going downhill, and like that's part of this kind of intelligence. Intrapersonal intelligence is your knowledge of yourself. So knowing your own motives, knowing your own emotional states, understanding the role of your past in your present behaviors. All of those things are part of intrapersonal. Interpersonal is your ability to do those same kinds of things, but for other people, right? Like recognize their motives, recognize their mental states, recognize, you know, how they're feeling about you. You have this ability to sort of manage other people's expectations. All of those things fall into interpersonal. And then there's naturalist, which refers to your ability to recognize your role in the environment. And so it has to do with ecosystems, it has to do with you sort of conservation, and not conservation of volume, which we talked about in another video, but actual, like sort of environmental types of conservation, that kind of thing. Knowing your role in the environment. And then finally, existentialist refers to your knowledge of like why you exist. What's the purpose in life? So in existentialist intelligence, a person who's high in that is has been able to at least generate or internalize explanations for why they're here, what the purpose of life is, and things like that. I hesitated for a second because it's like, well, I mean, do any of us really know what the purpose of life is? But if we can convince ourselves that we know what that is, then that's what's going on. So Gardner has been adding to this over time. When I was in college, there were 7. Yeah, there were 7. It stopped at interpersonal. Then by the time I was in graduate school, he had added existentialist. And then the most recent add-on has been the naturalist. And so he keeps adding on to these. And, a lot of people have criticized this model by saying that basically he's starting to get into talents or, preferences or other kinds of things that are not really measures of intelligence, but are something else. But others have said, well, you know what, if we address these things as being separate from each other and that they can work together but they don't depend on each other, we really can get a complex interpretation of different people's cognitions about different things. And so some people like that he keeps adding on and that he's adding more and more nuanced things onto the model. Like I said, you probably saw this model or it was actually used on you when you were in school, because a lot of teachers have really internalized the idea that different children may have different kinds of intelligences, and that we should use the ones that come naturally to them to help build the ones that we value the most in school. So for example, maybe you are naturally interested in sports, but maybe not that naturally good at reading, and so maybe we could lure you into reading by getting you to read about sports or something like that. So a lot of teachers have been trying to use one intelligence to help develop another, But see how I described it? You're interested in sports, and then you might use it to build verbal. Generally, when we're talking about intelligence, we don't use words like we're interested in this kind of intelligence. Like we don't usually talk about it like that. And so it's kind of a little bit confusing for me to talk about his model without kind of sounding like I am talking about preferences or talents, which are kind of separate. But I'm trying to be objective and not taint you guys, so hopefully I explained it in a way that makes sense and you can think whatever you want about it. Now, Piaget talks about intelligence, just like he talks about everything else, as being a process, that you are not born with a certain amount of intelligence and this is what you will have, but instead you develop intelligence across your lifespan, well, up until adolescence, really. So as he is when he's testing where a child is in his cognitive stage of development, he's really interested in how the person thinks, not whether they're getting answers right or wrong, but how they're arriving at their answers. And he thought that that what you know isn't as important as how you know what you know. Like when we talked about conservation, and you ask the child, does this one have more? Does that one have more? Do they both have the same amount? They give their answer, and then you ask, how do you know that? So it doesn't really matter whether they gave the right or wrong answer on the first part. What we want to know is, do they understand it? Right? Do they understand that there's the same amount no matter what it looks like? So Piaget is going to carry that through with all areas of intelligence. Now, he thought of intelligence as a process that develops as an interaction between the environment, the person's maybe innate predisposition to intelligence, and then the child's own motivations and things like that. And so he talks about intelligence as being really the result of a dynamic interplay of genes and environment and the child's own explorations that ultimately are going to develop the child's cognitive capacity that we might refer to as intelligence. So he definitely thought about it as more of a G factor type of thing. I think if he was here to talk about it, he would talk about it a lot like Spearman, with this basic process that is intelligence. But I think Spearman would make an argument that you sort of are born with more or less of this general intelligence, this ability to reason and whatever, whereas Piaget would say you're born with a predisposition towards a certain amount, but the interaction with the environment is going to really help to formulate your reasoning and your cognitions and stuff. So I think that Spearman and Piaget probably agree a lot, but it's that process component that's different for Piaget. Now, what about intelligence as an information processing model? If we think about intelligence as being really the cognitive strategies that you adopt to solve different kinds of problems, you're going to see that this model sounds a whole lot like a basic, Spearman G kind of model again, where it's like this composite of these cognitive strategies that you could apply to different scenarios. So, whereas Gardner says that you have all these individual types of intelligence that are independent of each other, an information processing theorist might say, well, the same kinds of cognitive strategies and capabilities that underlie your ability to solve math problems might underlie your ability to find the rhythm in a tune, or might underlie your ability to pick up on cues that are being provided by your friend that you're having a conversation with to determine whether they're bored by your story or whatever. So for information processing theorists, these cognitive strategies would apply in lots of different situations. And the great news about this model is that these cognitive strategies can be trained. So let me give you an example of a cognitive strategy at work. So let's say that you have black and brown socks in a drawer and they're mixed in a 4-to-5 ratio. How many socks would you need to pull out if you reach in blindly and you don't look at them? How many would you have to pull out to make sure that you have 2 of the same color in your hand when you pull your hand out? Normally I like to make my students struggle with this, but I'll just go ahead and tell you the answer. Well, let me prime you. I told you they're in a 4-to-5 ratio, but does that really matter? As long as there's only 2 colors, as long as you pull out 3, you're always going to get a combination that includes at least 2 that match. There's only 2 colors in there. If you pull out 3 socks, you're guaranteed that 2 of them have to be the same color. Let me apply it to something a little less abstract. If you have, let's say that you have 2 kids, one's a boy and one's a girl, and you are expecting your 3rd child, you're going to have 2 of the same sex. It's a guarantee. 2 of them are going to be the same sex. There's only 2 choices, and they're going to this 3rd one is going to, match one of the previous ones. I'm stammering a little bit because some of you might be listening going, what about intersex? Okay, in the 0.001% of births, there's a possibility that you may have a baby that you can't tell at birth whether it's a boy or a girl, male or female, external or internal genitalia. But biological sex, most of the time, I will say 99.9999%, you will be able to know that you have pulled out 2 of one kind or 2 of the other kind. Guaranteed, almost. All right, so now the last thing that I really wanted to talk about with regard to intelligence has to do with the nature-nurture controversy. So on the nature side of the argument, they say about 80% of intelligence is probably due to genes. So how do we know that? Well, I thought my picture was going to come up, so sorry my animation's messed up. I will answer my own question in a second. If you take the nurture side of the controversy, the argument is really that the genes interact with the environment to determine your ultimate outcome of intelligence. Okay, here's the picture I thought was going to come up. So on the nature side, people who say that 80% of intelligence is due to genes look at research like the fact that fraternal twins who were reared together, who grew up in the same household, tend to have lower correlations between their IQ scores than identical twins who were reared apart. So you can remember back when we talked about identical versus fraternal twins. Identical twins share 100% of their genes in common on average, and fraternal twins share 50% of their genes in common on average. So if you have 100% of your genes in common, but you guys were not reared in the same household, your intelligence, your IQ scores as measured by an intelligence test will be more similar to each other than people who share 50% of their genes in common, but were raised in the same household. Through research like this, researchers have come to the conclusion that about 80% of intelligence is probably attributable to genes. But I have to reveal the rest of this chart where we find that identical twins who are reared apart are less similar in intelligence than identical twins who are reared together. So environment has to play some role. Absolutely. So if you look at this chart, you notice that the people who have the most similar IQ scores on this chart are the identical twins who share 100% of their genes in common and who are raised together. So they have very similar upbringings. You take a little stair step down if you remove their shared environment. You take another almost equivalent stair step down if now you are in the same environment, but now you only have 50% of your genes in common. You take another stair step down if you have siblings who typically share 50% of their genes in common, but were not in the womb at the same time, but they were reared together. So taking up that shared uterine environment, plus I have to comment that fraternal twins are treated much more similarly than regular siblings are. Fraternal twins are more likely, even if one's a boy and one's a girl, to be referred to as the twins and to be dressed similarly and to go to the same kinds of events at the same time so that they are very similar to each other. And then our final stair step down is when you have unrelated individuals who are raised together. So if you change the degree of overlap of the environment, you get a drop in correlation between the two individuals' IQ scores. If you change the amount of genes in common, you get almost exactly same amount of stair step down in correlation. So we have to acknowledge that intelligence really, genes really set us up probably for a particular range of intelligence, and then the environment helps to determine where we fall in that range. The good news is that most environments help to facilitate us to get to our maximum IQs. It's usually only neglectful environments that could pull our IQs down, like lack of nutrition, lack of interaction. That can pull IQs down, but generally IQs will reach their fullest capacity in a just regular standard, adequately nutrition, adequately interaction. You're going to have a child who grows to reach probably their fullest genetic potential. All right, that's enough on intelligence. In the next segment, I'll pick up with memory.